Hey folks, thanks for joining. It is Wednesday, July 2nd. I'm Matt Reardon, and it is a privilege to talk with you about the weather every day. So I appreciate you taking time out of your day to follow along with us. I love doing it, and I'm happy you're watching. I do want to say Eric was supposed to be with you all here this morning, but he's having poor data issues, understandably, on vacation. So hopefully getting back him here sometime this week. But today we have plenty of weather to talk about and some changes, I think, in the models too that's worth mentioning. I'm starting here today. This is essentially an infrared satellite loop of almost the whole country of Mexico. You can see the Gulf of Mexico there on the right, and then the far eastern Pacific there on the left. And I'm doing that because we get this great view of Hurricane Flossy, strengthened into a Category 3 hurricane yesterday. You can see that open eye there. And over the last few frames here, at least through the morning hours, early morning, it has weakened. So you had this large presentation yesterday through the afternoon. And then to the overnight, you can see it weakening a bit, just a smaller storm overall, maybe 12 hours later. Nonetheless, still a weak Category 3 hurricane, but fortunately moving in this direction here. And it is releasing these hurricanes once they reach that major status like that. Release a lot and exhaust a lot of heat into the upper atmosphere here, and that can help to reinforce some ridging to their north. And it's worth mentioning all this tropical convection here along the continent of North America as well. And you can see some of this outflow. I don't know if you can see some of this, what we call this transverse cirrus banding kind of emanating off of some of these thunderstorms here. You can see some of this around Hurricane Flossy as well, just indicative that there's a lot of heat being released down here into the upper atmosphere, and that is going to be felt by the flow further to the north across the continental U.S. You can see some of that here just looking at the water vapor satellite. Again, here's the eastern Pacific, the continent of North America, and then the Atlantic as well. There's Hurricane Flossy here, but there's a tremendous amount of thunderstorm development just across Mexico. Some drought areas here getting relief, even up into the northwest part of the country where there's a diverse range of crops. But if you look to the north, I don't know what I was mentioning earlier, over Texas, New Mexico, even Arizona, if you just kind of follow the trajectories of some of these clouds, you notice here they're moving this way. Here they're moving kind of west to east. Up here over Nebraska, had some overnight storms yesterday afternoon. You notice they're moving in that direction. If we go over Montana, they're kind of moving in this direction. And this cutoff low here, maybe near Oxnard, California, they're moving in this direction. And what I'm trying to point out here is with all this activity here, subtropical low here, this trough that we talked about yesterday, well, we're building in a pretty expansive ridge across the middle part of the country, almost, right along the continental divide. That's not atypical this time of year, but this is an impressive ridge now. There's almost ridges within the ridge here. So this is an impressive July ridge that we'll have to talk about. There's going to be some warmth associated with this as it moves to the east here this week, bringing some heat to the 4th of July. Parties heading on over in the eastern part of the country, and then some dry conditions with it that we'll have to talk about considering which month that we're in our growing season. If we jump over and look at the 500 millibar heights, just valid as of this morning, and looking at those winds, here's Hurricane Flossy. You can make that out pretty easily on the bottom part of this map. But that expansive ridge underneath that, and I mentioned there's almost like ridges within the ridges. I can count, one here, kind of one here, and almost another one here. So it's an expansive one. It runs almost from, Arizona and New Mexico all the way over toward Illinois and Arkansas at this point, and the heat is building in underneath it as well. As a result, if we look over at the radar mosaic, I start with this almost every morning, and there's typically much more on the screen. Even just yesterday, we noticed there's more going on in the overnight hours. Now, we do have some showers and thunderstorms, some remnants of that tropical convection moving over Texas. Some of this got into portions of southern Texas here, which are still in some pretty significant drought classifications, not into the whole area that's under some of those more extreme classifications, but some of this rainfall getting closer and closer to those counties, which is good to see. Saw some overnight storms move through Nebraska, bringing some decent rains here. This area has really had some serious localized rainfall in recent days, and that continued overnight. And if you look closely, that kind of caught my eye there at the end. That little MCV, we call these mesoscale convective vortices. I studied these in school, frankly, so they immediately catch my eye. And if we jump over and look closer, you can see this little spin in the atmosphere. Do you see that right there? It's almost like it doesn't look dissimilar from a tropical storm. In fact, morphologically, if you want to get into it, they're not terribly dissimilar. But that little spin later on in the day, as this kind of drifts off either to the southeast or maybe due east over Iowa, northern Missouri, Illinois, they can sometimes refocus thunderstorm development along or ahead of them. You can almost kind of see that here in eastern Nebraska. So the HRRR and the NAM, some of these convecting allowing models that we track, are pretty skeptical that this activity is going to continue further east, but you never know. So to keep an eye on here, maybe southern Iowa, northern Missouri, western Illinois, some areas in here wouldn't discount some of the precipitation. So being that precip, if we just jump over and look at the last 24 hours of precip here, this is radar derived. I mentioned southern Texas. Those like almost tropical-like rains getting into the southern counties there. Some of these still in the significant drought classification, some of this getting up into the Panhandle area. But otherwise a pretty paltry map in terms of summertime precipitation. We saw the storms move through the southeast and the mid-Atlantic yesterday. Saw some flood warnings out for portions of the DMV area. But underneath that expansive ridge, you can see the ridge, by the way, in these like rain streets. Do you see that? You almost just kind of make out where that ridge is and then the lack of precipitation underneath that, say, for a few select areas. And that's really one of the reasons why those CAM models, as it's pulling that MCV through northern Missouri, I mean, it's just underneath this expanding ridge. And it's that much harder for those thunderstorms to form in rising heights like that. I was going to jump over and look at the Storm Prediction Center reports, but those did not load. There we go. Let's pull that up again. Zoom those in. And really what I'm looking at here is all the reports over here in Virginia, Maryland, over toward Delaware. Up into portions of Pennsylvania, saw some severe thunderstorms move through here, had a severe thunderstorm warning for the capital in the afternoon, and then just a few other storms here over portions of Mississippi. Saw some large hail in far western Nebraska, as well as just a scattering of other reports. And this kind of monsoonal-like flow that we've seen, that subtropical low, I mentioned that near Oxnard, just pulling moisture up into the Four Corners area. And we've seen a quick start to the monsoon season here out west. Some of these daytime thunderstorms. We'll jump over and look at the Storm Prediction Center outlook for today. You can see the ridge even in the risk areas here, so you can kind of draw the periphery of that ridge as it's expanding across the middle part of the country, and then underneath it, right, an almost lack of thunderstorm development. It's not common for a stretch of Kansas over to Pennsylvania not to see almost any thunderstorm activity in the middle of July. And the reason for that is this expansive ridge that's now positioned over the area. We jump over and look at one of those cams. This is the 3-kilometer NAM model. I'm going to let's make it valid about 6 a.m. And just a tip here, anytime, so I remember we just showed you that MCV moving through eastern Nebraska. I mean, this is recording this video about 5:30 a.m. And there's still some precip falling here. I mean, over toward Omaha, you can see that spinning MCV. And if I jump over and show you the NAM forecast, which was initialized 6 hours before, where was that? Let's pull that up. There it is. I have this valid about 6 a.m. and that's not even there. So whenever I see one of these models fail to correctly identify something that's happening now, I discount how accurate that model is going to be out in the forecast. If you can't tell me where you're at now, I'm not going to believe when you're going to tell me where you're going, right? It's just kind of a simple forecasting trick. So while I'm going to play this forecast forward, we do see some shower activity moving through Wisconsin today. This is going to be light. Maybe some storms moving through Iowa late. There's some question marks on these. If you remember, the Storm Prediction Center did not have expansive risks area out today. Over toward Montana as well this afternoon. This is really 10 p.m. now, Wednesday Central Time. That continued monsoonal precipitation over the Four Corners region. Some light showers and thunderstorm activity over the Carolinas this evening as well. But have some question marks about almost all of this, given just the expansive nature of the ridge here. And then we also mentioned that the NAM was struggling a little bit this morning. If I take this into tomorrow, this is now, let's do 4 to 5 p.m. Central Time. Maybe just very light showers here stretching through portions of the central Corn Belt. Continuing to see some of this activity shift a little bit further to the east. That was over the Intermountain West. And the reason for that is the ridge where we started this forecast was maybe here. We're just shifting it east about 400 miles. Now it's a little bit positioned like that. So we're seeing some of these maybe ridge riding thunderstorm activity shift as well along with that. And then Florida seeing some beneficial precip as well here through the day tomorrow. If we go overnight tomorrow, this is Thursday night into Friday morning. You can see on the periphery of that ridge maybe a more substantial storm system moving through the Dakotas and through upper Minnesota, but all the while underneath the ridge as we get toward the 4th of July. Fair weather and warming temperatures throughout the portions of the Midwest. We jump over and look at the day 2 outlook. This from the Storm Prediction Center. Mentioned again on the periphery of that ridge here. This is for Thursday. Potential thunderstorm development there tomorrow. We'll have to see if it gets into portions of the northern Minnesota overnight. And then again, maybe seeing some shower and thunderstorm development over the Chicago, southern Wisconsin area. There are some very dry counties in here, so I'm going to be watching that very closely. Again, just to kind of hyper focus on that. Let's go back to tomorrow. Thursday afternoon. This is now 6 p.m. You can see the NAM kind of struggling to put down some precipitation into this area. So there is kind of a marginal risk for severe storms here, maybe some wind and hail as a result of that, but there is some question marks as to whether these storms even go. And I don't know how much we can trust the NAM right now. We'll take a look at the ECMWF in just a few slides. Another way to visualize this kind of west-east movement of the ridge, if we just look at the high temperatures and their anomalies today. So this is valid for Wednesday, July 2nd. You can see the expansive warmth in Montana. This stretches up into the Canadian prairie as well. But really just how large that ridge is. I mean, we're seeing warm temperatures from Omaha all the way over toward Indianapolis and toward Pennsylvania as well. We're seeing those thunderstorms, those monsoon-like thunderstorms underneath the heat, are actually keeping temperatures down here. I showed you some of that tropical rainfall pushing into southern Texas, lingering rainfall today for the Carolinas and Florida, keeping those temperatures down relative to early July temperatures. Take the forecast into Thursday. Again, you just see that ridge shifting every day, a few hundred miles. Now Friday, the holiday positioned right over the Midwest. So 90s across the board for the I-states, the upper Midwest, even into portions of the Mid-South. But behind it, cooling. And so if you think about the periphery of this ridge, where we're going to expect thunderstorm development, you'd think on the back side of that, slowly getting through this week Friday, and then I'm going to take this forecast into Saturday, Sunday. So as this ridge starts to come all the way and make its influence felt in the eastern U.S., suddenly now the periphery of this ridge stretches through portions of the western Corn Belt and through portions of the plains. So potentially an uptick in precipitation as we get through the week and toward this weekend on the backside of this ridge, just because it allows us to get into kind of the periphery of underneath that. 90s moving over toward the eastern Corn Belt, Mid-Atlantic, and New England as we get through this weekend of the weekend. And then kind of pattern just keeps on trucking. We bring the heat back to the northwestern U.S., bring temperatures down early next week across portions of the Midwest, and building in potentially some northwest ridging that we talked about yesterday as we get into next week, which could bring some northwest flow thunderstorms to this corridor here. An important stretch as we get toward pollination, cooler overnight temperatures with thunderstorm chances. And you're talking about a pretty bumper-like crop in this area, depending on what we see in late July and early August. But shaping up right now, I'll talk about this as we kind of get through the video, but this mid-July forecast could be pretty friendly, at least over the next 2 weeks. If we look at the all hazards map here today from the National Weather Service, pretty light. Again, despite that expansive ridge, we're seeing the heat kind of slowly build relative to average. So heat advisories valid in eastern Montana, some red flag warnings out for portions of the Intermountain West, Washington, and Oregon. Some lingering fog warnings and flood watches here for portions of the Southwest, but otherwise a pretty quiet day across the U.S. I'm going to jump over and show you the ECMWF precip forecast. I'm doing this because I want to see on the backside of that ridge, this corridor here, how that precipitation coverage expands to the east throughout the week. So this takes us to Wednesday tonight. See, showers and thunderstorms potentially in Texas on the weaker side. Maybe some peripheral development here over Wisconsin. Let's go into Thursday afternoon. Question marks as to thunderstorm development here over eastern Iowa, Minnesota, southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, the Chicago metro area, even into southern Indiana. Could happen, can't rule it out, even that marginal risk out from the Storm Prediction Center. But as this ridge now moves a little bit to the east, we see some of this precipitation building in on the back side of it. Take this into Friday evening. Now we're talking Nebraska, South Dakota, Minnesota, southeastern North Dakota, maybe even Kansas, Wyoming, northeastern Colorado. Seeing this precipitation, thunderstorm coverage build in on the backside of the ridge here, and a lack of it underneath that ridge over the Midwest and the east. By Saturday, that activity moving all the way over toward Iowa, Missouri, eastern Nebraska, Kansas, stretching back toward Montana, maybe even portions of the Canadian prairie. Seeing that activity expand across the prairie, Alberta, at least the northern portions of it on Sunday afternoon. And this precipitation getting all the way over toward the I-states, Michigan, down through the middle Mississippi River Valley, and through portions of the southern plains on Sunday. Monday, a lingering front here, bringing more precipitation to the Ohio River Valley. And then next week, that regime flips back to that northwest ridge. And again, the periphery of that, right? So over here in British Columbia, you can see northwest flow potentially here through the middle part of the country. And next week, seeing favorable chances for precipitation, I think, for the Midwest. And you can almost still kind of draw that ridge in that fashion as we go through the week next week. Now, I mentioned that kind of northwest flow, that potential to set up a ridge here, which would bring heights down, bring northwest flow thunderstorm chances to the Midwest. It was predicated in that conversation yesterday on the potential for typhoon development in this corridor here. I'm really looking northeast of the Philippines and southeast of Japan, east of Taiwan and Hong Kong as well. Now, from the ECMWF AIFS, the model I'm showing you now, as I take this forecast, can see weak low pressure system development here due east of Japan. Was seeing on some of the models, the ECMWF and the GFS yesterday, stronger, almost kind of significant typhoon development northeast of the Philippines. At least this run here from the ECMWF AIFS, I'm not seeing as much of it. Maybe weak development. There's some question marks as to whether that's even getting toward typhoon classification. But I'm still seeing this North Pacific jet behave similarly. So there's perhaps enough convection here with some of these weak systems that the North Pacific jet is still behaving in the way that we saw it yesterday. And even if I jump over and look at the ECMWF, it's kind of surprised me a little bit. ECMWF also had some weaker development than it did the day before. Maybe some development. We're still seeing that increase, that pickup in the North Pacific jet, bringing up into a ridge over the northwest. And this is out toward next Wednesday, bringing some lower heights and some troughing generally. Not cold temperatures by any means, probably seasonal, maybe even on the warmer side, but precipitation chances to the Midwest next week. Seeing that kind of on all the models here, sticking with that more northwest ridging regime. And I think what might be happening here is that we have a lack of momentum in the atmosphere. Eric and I have talked about that this year. We're going through April into May. We're below average in terms of our global angular momentum. Now, we picked it up as the month of June came around, but it's just decreased even rapidly therein. And we've talked about the concern to set up ridges somewhere over the continental U.S. as a result of this lack of momentum. And you can see this in a few different fashions. This is one graph here. Eric showed you a different one that showed a whole kind of map of the globe itself and the negative anomalies of that momentum kind of spreading up toward the mid-latitudes. This is just more of a numerical value that just shows straight up it's below average. And when we look historically at Julys where we have a lack of average angular momentum, this June we just shift over to July here. We know we're lower than that. Now our forecast, this one just from the CFS, I'm going to blow this up here. It's over that same kind of plot here. It does have us getting back toward neutral and then positive angular momentum all the way out maybe July 20th or 25th. But at least through the first half of the month of July, staying in that lower average angular momentum. And if we look over and go to history as a guide, as Eric and I often do, and we just correlate July temperatures to pick 1980 to 2014 here, where the data shut off, and we correlate low average angular momentum with temperatures in July, we see warmer temperatures here over the Intermountain West in the western U.S. I know it's colored blue here. That is confusing, but these are negative anomalies, and we have to consider that we have a negative atmospheric momentum. And as a result of that, we have to flip the sign of this. So that means that this is really telling us that those years tended to be warmer in the western U.S., even getting over into the western Corn Belt, cooler in the midsection of the country, some of the I states over toward the Carolinas as well. Again, we have to flip that color bar. Now, critically, if we do the same experiment with temperature, this one we actually, or I should say precipitation instead of temperature. This one, well, we don't have to necessarily flip the color bar. We have to flip the sign here. So negative momentum actually does line up with the color bar. So warmer temperatures in these red colors here. Now the plot actually says above average precipitation, but we have to, again, flip that because we're in a negative AAM rather than a positive AAM regime as we go through at least the first 3 weeks of July. And this lines up with the Climate Prediction Center forecast we talked about yesterday. It lines up with that typhoon thought experiment we performed yesterday out of the textbook, that generally looking at less precipitation in the northwest part of the country, potentially bleeding out into portions of the northern plains in the western Corn Belt or northern Corn Belt, and heat in this area as well, indicated by correlation with the temperatures here. And if this heat expands further to the north, again, that's juicing that monsoonal activity underneath that. So continue to see that over portions of Arizona and the Four Corners states. Now, I wanted to confirm this. Do we see this in the upper level height data? And I want to give a shout out to Eric Webb, good Twitter follow, for putting some of this data together. This is looking at all the way 1958 to 2014. Given this kind of correlation I did with some of the district data here, I wanted to see if that came true looking at the 500 millibar heights. And from what I could see from him and then plugging the data in myself, that seems to be the case where when we have lower average angular momentum, we tend to get more ridging here. And I fixed the color bar for us here over the northwest United States. So it could bring northwest flow into portions of the upper Midwest or the central Midwest, bringing temperatures down in this area, the eastern Corn Belt as well, but keeping that heat and keeping that drought risk further toward the northwest, at least for the first 3 weeks of July. So with the typhoon conversation that we looked at yesterday with the average angular momentum, we're looking at here today. Again, I see enough support, and then from the Climate Prediction Center and some of the models here, that I'm not as worried about intense heat and a lack of precipitation getting into the Midwest, the Mid-South, or the eastern U.S. as we head at least through these first 2 to 3 weeks of July. We'll have to see where we're going after that. In fact, if we just kind of extend the thought experiment and we correlate those temperatures with August and we stay in a lower momentum state, that heat tends to shift further to the west, and those precipitation values fall further toward the middle Mississippi River Valley into some of the ice states here, the Eastern Corn Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan as well, continuing to stay dry out here in the Northwest as well. But again, this is predicated on staying low in that momentum. So we'll have to watch that going forward, because we just looked at one of these forecasts that said we could be going positive into the month of July, or I should say August. There are some forks in the road and some things that we'll have to watch going forward here. At least wanted to paint you through that. I want to jump back here. I glossed over this quickly. I want to look at the 7-day average anomalies from the ECMWF. I mean, we walked through this forecast, but you can see it here with more activity in this corridor here. As that ridge sets up over the next 5 to 7 days, over more of the Midwest and the Eastern U.S. through the 4th and the holiday weekend, seeing precipitation values fall here. We noted yesterday this kind of corridor of a lack of precipitation in here, and it's definitely going to be on a drier stretch here as we get through the first part of July in here. But we saw late next week, it's that ridge built into the Northwest. We just kind of did that thought experiment here that brings that Northwest flow over this corridor. Chances for low pressure systems briefly to develop and thunderstorms to push through this area. So I would expect by Wednesday and Thursday of next week, which is not necessarily captured on this 7-day forecast, for this area to fill in. And we can see that if we shift the forecast out to a 10-day forecast, where some of these values start to fill in across central Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, a corridor here that we've talked about going over dry just in recent days here. I do want to jump over and show you, again, those soil moisture values. They've decreased even day to day here across northern central Illinois, northern Indiana, portions of southern Michigan as well. So eyeing this area here, right, looking at potential 7-day dry stretch here. We'll have to see what falls tomorrow across northern Illinois, the Chicago area. Iowa, we looked at the chance for that. Given the kind of general drought already built into this area, at least the dryness over the last 2 weeks, those thunderstorms probably on the paltry side tomorrow. So keeping an eye on this quarter as we get into next week, needing some rainfall, despite the relatively friendly temperature forecast, I think, through mid-July that we looked at. Kind of reinforcing, again, the lack of temperature concern on the middleist, maybe the Midwest or the Mid-South and the Mid-East part of the country, is looking at the MJO. So this is showing us a map of ascent across the tropics, really across the whole globe, but I'm focused on the tropics here where we see these green colors. And this is a 5-day rolling forecast of that ascent in the atmosphere, trying to point out where that MJO is. And really right now we see it over the Western Pacific, the maritime continent, that is Indonesia, over the Philippines. So I take this forecast into mid-July. This is now the 4th and the 5th through the 10th and through the 12th. We don't really see it moving much. Some activity picking up here over Africa and the far western Indian Ocean, but still seeing that MJO activity kind of parked here over phases, maybe 5, 6, and 7. And if we at least look to history as a guide through mid-July, phases 5, 6, and 7. Let's jump over. Let's go to phase 5. Looking at that trough ridge pattern, we take this in through 10th of July, right over that same period that we saw. We see phase 5, phase 6, maybe phase 7. We tend to see that northwest ridging, right? At least the 10th of July. If we move this over, maybe getting out into the middle of the July, 10th through the 20th. Again, northwest ridging, troughing over the Great Lakes, perhaps northwest flow between that. Now, if I'm going to take this forecast out further, right, we still have a while to go on this. This is the ECMWF AFS Ensemble, one of the newest AI models that we have. And I take it out through the 12th through the 17th. While we still see ascent here in the Western Pacific, maybe in phase 6 and 7, we see some picking back up over here, maybe phase 3, phase 4. And I'm watching to see if this wins out, what that might mean. If we look maybe to that next week of July, late July, phase 3 or phase 4. It doesn't show up as well in the contours here, but I see ridging here over the Great Lakes. We follow some of these contours, and certainly in phase 3. So there is this possibility that as we get through the month of July and toward the latter part of the month, shifting toward August, we saw that, right, kind of in our thought experiment, this low momentum, that we could be shifting some of the heat and the drier risk over portions of the Midwest or the Eastern U.S. getting through the month of July. And it wouldn't be dissimilar from this pattern that we've seen that tends to shift the drought risk around. That's not necessarily a bad thing because it hasn't significantly built into any one area over time. But it does mean that we'll have to maybe watch out for it at the end of July heading into August, which is, as we know, still a critical month, kind of bracketing July here. Kind of doubling back again through the middle part of the July, the Climate Prediction Center, above average chances for heat across the Northwest, but critically, as we shift into pollination across a wide area of the country here, near normal seasonal temperatures across a wide section of the middle Mississippi River Valley. And then if we look at the precipitation outlook over that same time period, with that northwest flow generally present and this kind of stalled fronts lingering here across the Mid-South or the Carolinas. Generally favorable for precipitation and the middle part of the country as well. A relatively good forecast for production depending on which exact state that we're in this part of the country. But I do want to shift that ECMWF AFS ensemble forecast out a little bit further. So this is the 11th through the 12th. This is looking at 500 millibar heights, the troughs and ridges. I'm taking it all the way out to the 14th and 15th. And I'm not seeing, at least this model doesn't go that far, all the way out to the 17th. Still see maybe some ridging across the western part of the country, some troughing here over the east. We do see some ridging starting to pick back up over New England. And so that might be something to watch. We're seeing that here this week as well. If we get later into the forecast period, some heat potentially moving into New England this month. I believe the Climate Prediction Center perhaps noted some of that with their monthly outlook. There's that 1 month outlook. This updated just this week here. And they do highlight the chances for above average temperatures across New England, even stretching over toward Minnesota, or I should say Wisconsin and Michigan as well in that outlook here. So watching a few of these things play out. But again, the forecast over the next 10 to 15 days does not look as critical, at least for temperatures in this region here. I'll be back with you all tomorrow to talk through it. Thanks for watching here today.